Rites of passage are important in all societies. Birth, then the transition from youth to adulthood, marriage, and death are key rites of passage. What we should not expect is any uniformity in Viking society. And we are talking about hundreds of years and about a geographical area that spans all the way from North America to Scandinavia.
For information about that, we really have to look to the sagas from later Norway and Iceland. So presumably these were important rites, but we don't unfortunately have the formulae for how such a rite would be performed.
But we know that it was a ritualized society, A, because all Iron Age societies were ritualized, and B, because we know that there were temple priests, for example, and there was a certain way of chanting and so on. So we've given ourselves the liberty of making up, I suppose, certain rituals to mark the passage of time. We would only not use them if they didn't ring true or they seemed to come from later on, from some later culture.
Viking birthing rituals would have varied from place to place, and they would have changed over time, and the details are very often unclear.
Most children were born at home. There were no hospitals. And the child would be washed and presented to the father. And the father would inspect the child. And if he wanted to raise it, he would give it some kind of a gift. He would give it a name, and he would sprinkle it with water in a ritual that might have been something like baptism.
What should we call her? Hey.
One of the most important stages was probably the naming of a child. Because when you name a child, you give it an identity and you declare that it belongs to a family.
We do know that children were raised in the families by their parents, but also fostered out to other families to form other alliances. And men taught boys and women taught girls.
We let such babies die for their own good. For what kind of life could he live?
If the child were found wanting, if the child had a deformity that was visible, if the child appeared to be particularly weak, or even if it was just a period of great famine or poverty, then the child would be left out in the elements.
We do know that the way that children were removed was by exposing them. They were taken out to a hillside or a forest. And there are many stories of people finding such children and then bringing them up.
But there is a difference between exposure of a child and the outright killing of a child. Because when you expose a child to the elements, there is the remote chance that the child might actually survive.
So, I mean, there is this sort of cynical, cold, practical side to it, but there's also a supernatural side to it, because people did not understand what deformities were. And so they might be viewed as demons or monsters if they had some kind of very noticeable deformity.
Now, the abandoning or the exposure of a child, a deformed child or a weak child, was legal in Viking society, but it's also clear that there was shame attached to it. So it was not certainly something that was encouraged, but it was permissible.
Well, education was vocational. A boy is being raised to take over his father's role. And so if a father is a smith, the child would be trained in smithcraft as well. If the father has a farm, then the boy will learn all of the skills that he needs for farm work, and he'll begin to go on raids, perhaps as young as 12. We do know that boys were often trained to fight as early as 10, 11, 12. And as for women, it would be the same. Women are trained by their mothers or by their older sisters to take the roles that are expected of women in this society.
And Viking society is somewhat unusual in Europe at the time for the high respect given to women in this point, is that they could inherit and they had a place within the family and a say that was larger than in most European societies.
There was a practical side to education, the use of tools and the use of weapons, but then there's also, one could say, an ideological side to the education of children, because you have to instill certain ideals in a child. And that was probably done through the telling of stories, through the singing of songs, and through poetry. And when we look at some of the early Viking poetry, for example, the Havamal, we learn what a good Viking was supposed to be like. A good Viking had to be protective of his good name. He had always to be prepared, not hasty in his judgment. He had to be charming, but he had to be careful with women. And when you imagine a boy hearing that for the first time, he will probably ask his father, what does that mean? How do you do that? And then the father would be expected to supply the examples.
They lured him into a gloomy chamber. And then they snuck up on him. And then they stabbed him. Dead.
I think most Vikings are given the chance to carve out their own destiny. The parents will teach them everything they need in their everyday life as a farmer, as a trader, as a raider. But when it comes to their own destiny and what they're going to achieve, it's up to them. There's lots of tales and sagas where Viking men were there at the birth of their child and they throw down an axe or a sword and say, this is all you need to carve your way through life, son.
Children of chieftains and children of wealthy farmers were fostered out to other people who then formed an alliance, and then the child not only had his own siblings, brothers and sisters, but he also had the brothers and sisters in the foster family and learned from the foster father. And the foster father was responsible for supporting. So it's a way of extending the family group and educating the children.
We know that when a boy grew his first beard, when his beard started to come in, that was an important signal that he was becoming a man. Also, the first weapon would presumably be an important rite of passage because male citizens of the Icelandic Republic and the Norwegian Kingdom in the Middle Ages were required to be armed.
The age is surprisingly young. 12 years was when an Icelandic young man in at least the 12th century came of full age, and surely that goes back to the Viking period.
Fought well today, Bia. Thank you, Uncle. You have a lot to learn.
There would have been no set age for a Viking child to be initiated in the ways of battle, probably because a child would early on be exposed to weapons in various ways.
We have an Icelandic saga, it's called Egil's Saga. At the age of 5, at a game in which families are together, he is pushed around by a slightly older boy. He goes and gets an axe, kills the older boy. His parents are sort of proud of him, and the mother says he'll be given a ship when he's older. Gives you an idea that this kind of violence and success at violence was esteemed.
We can assume that there were rituals between fathers and sons, but they would have not been uniform in Viking society. Much like today, certain families, probably every family has specific traditions of things that get passed on from the grandfather to the father to the son.
There is, of course, the anxiety of mortality that is present in any culture. But with such vague ideas of the afterlife, that anxiety about mortality often manifests in a very real world context. Will I be remembered? And of course, it's your sons primarily who are going to remember you, to make sure that you're remembered, to avenge you if some wrong has been done to you, to maintain the honor of your family, and by extension, your own honor as an individual.
You can continue your name best when you are Eric, the son of, and that's a standard naming practice. So naming practices are very, very important. While very often, for example, with regard to girls, we have a descriptor of the girl. So we would have a name of a girl and then the radiant or something. So an adjective that would describe the girl, while when it comes to a son, the name of the father is attached to the son. So the father lives on in the son.
Also, of course, most Vikings are both farmers in the summer, raiders in the winter, and you need someone to run the farm. Slaves aren't necessarily that reliable, but you can rely on your own sons because they'll inherit the land.
You did not hesitate today.
The Vikings probably considered the armoring an essential artifact, and archaeologists have found quite a few armorings, and many of them are made from precious metals, from silver and gold.
Armorings are an important demonstration both of wealth and of service done to an important king or jarl. So we often read about a jarl or a king who wants to reward a man who's fought under him and takes an armoring off of his arm and gives it to some man who served him well. or perhaps even just written a good poem in praise of him.
We know a lot about the artifacts themselves of arm rings, that we find them in graves, and in the poetry they speak of princes as breakers of rings, and what they're talking about is an arm ring that a prince in a festival or in a feast would take and break part of his gold or silver ring and pass it out to followers, and it was a way of keeping wealth and distributing wealth.
But you have to have a certain, for example, size of an arm to carry an arm ring so that the arm ring can't fall off. So you can't really give the arm ring to a child. You have to give it to a young adult. You have to give it to a youth that is strong enough. And then it's an indication of the wealth being passed on. But rings were also used, for example, to swear an oath. And so when you're wearing such a ring, you are capable of engaging in business. You can enter into marriage. So it could have been used as a rite of passage, but it would not have been exclusive to boys, because women wore arm rings as well.
Since no axe, spear, or blade could touch my son today, he will now be known as Björn Ironside.
I think that the rites of passage to a Viking and how different it is to modern children in the day and age we live in is not too dissimilar. The main difference is that we are led to believe now that we have to nurture our children, to know that they're going to go on through life and be comfortable and successful. Not very much has changed in the Viking society, only that you give your Viking child all the skills he'll need, but then ultimately it's up to him to carve his own way through destiny.